Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Peacebuilding Network International Conference that we're having this week. And welcome to our panel on women's leadership in peacebuilding. I'm Dr. Maryann Cusimano Love from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. We're the only pontifical university in the United States to educate mainly lay people. I have been blessed to work as a peacebuilding scholar and activist for over 2 decades. I serve on the steering committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, as well as on Pope Francis's Security Task Force, and as a consultant to the Holy See Mission at the United Nations. Over 20 years ago, civil society organizations pressed the United Nations to adopt a series of resolutions on women, peace, and security. From UN Security Council Resolution 1325 to the successor resolutions, these have changed international norms. They decry rape and sexual violence, that they not be used as tools of war. They commit that women must be included and participate in peace and security activities in all aspects of peace building and negotiations. And they call on all countries to establish and implement national action plans for including women's leadership in all phases of peace building. Civil society led the way and continues to lead in the women, peace, and security agenda. The pandemic upended plans for a big 20th anniversary assessment at the United Nations. That was intended not just to mark a milestone, but also to hold actors accountable to keeping their commitments and to shine a light on the benefits of expanding women's leadership and participation in peace building. The moral principles are clear. Women are human beings with full human rights and the rights to full participation in peace building. In addition to the moral case, the data is clear. Peace processes work better and they last longer when women participate. For all the advances that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has brought, it has had a bit of a blind spot for inclusion of women religious leaders, women of faith, or women working with religious affiliated organizations for a number of reasons. Most wars are conducted demographically, we know, by men as the armed actors. So if you conceive of peace processes as those that bring together the violent actors, women by definition are going to be excluded from that definition as not being one of the armed actors. Also, women, peace, and security efforts in more recent years to include greater participation of women in the peace processes have often overlooked women of faith and women leaders in religious organizations. Similarly, governmental efforts in recent years to engage with religious actors in peace building often translates into dialogues with male clerical leaders, not appreciating or engaging with women leaders. So we find ourselves as women leaders in peace building often dubbed as, quote, invisible to the powerful actors. So what you have this morning, women who will be here with us today, is a panel of so-called invisible actors, the group of people who supposedly do not exist, women leaders in peace building and women leaders of faith in peace building. But I assure you, we are not mythical creatures. You will find us in every war zone around the world. While the men fight, while some commit atrocities, while refugees and IDPs and civilians flee seeking safety, these women remain. They go to the places of pain and crises. They roll up their sleeves and serve. Every day, these women practice a model of servant leadership that is not at all invisible to the suffering communities they are part of. Women lead in all aspects of peace building, in ministering to refugees and internally displaced persons, as we will hear from our colleague of Caritas Ukraine, in providing healthcare and trauma healing for women and girls raped and victimized by sexual violence and war, as we will hear from the Philippines, in provision of food and healthcare and emergency services, in negotiations with the violent actors, as we'll hear with colleagues in the Philippines and South Sudan, and in rebuilding societies torn apart by long-standing conflicts, in provision of education and restructuring systems, something we'll hear from all of our colleagues today. Women leaders build connections across identity groups and lines of conflict, and they women bear witness, telling painful truths about wars. Women leaders open space and build capacity for future generations, including future generations of women leaders. And these are among the many ways in which women build peace. We are blessed to have with us today some of the world's top leaders in peace building, who are women, and who will be in the first round of our question and discussion today, describing their activities and the peace building activities of their organizations, particularly with regards to advancing women, peace, and security in peace building. Later, in the second round of dialogue, we will offer their prescriptions. They will offer their lessons learned for advancing the participation of women in peace building and in growing women's leadership. We will go in the order listed in the program, and that will have us starting with official peace processes and then moving to other aspects of peace building. We will begin with the Philippines, a country that can teach us all a master class in women's leadership in peace building. We are honored and thank you today for joining us. We have first up Professor Miriam Coronel-Ferrer, a Filipino peace negotiator and professor of political science at the University of the Philippines. She began her peace building work as an underground activist during the Marcos dictatorship, a very dangerous time when many of her friends were killed and activists were raped, tortured, and detained. She continued her work in peace building and eventually went from underground to chairing the official peace process panel of the government of the Philippines during the tenure of President Benigno Aquino from 2010 to 2016. On behalf of the Philippines government, she signed the comprehensive agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, making her the first female chief negotiator in the world to sign a final peace accord with a rebel group. From the Philippines to the United Nations, she serves with the United Nations team of senior mediators, during which she provided mediation services to UN support efforts in missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Maldives, Kosovo, Georgia, Southeast Asia, among many others. Thank you, Professor. Congratulations on your efforts. What a journey. Can you describe for us some of the highlights of your work, advancing the inclusion and practicing women's leadership in peace building?
Thank you. Thank you, Maryann. And first of all, it's my pleasure to join for the first time, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network in one of your events in this conference, in this session called Women's Peace Leadership, which is, of course, can be understood in two different ways. It can be about peace leadership of women. We're talking about what does it really mean what does peace really mean for women? Therefore, women's peace and the leadership that really has to be developed, sustained, empowered in effect to be able to see through the outcomes that would lead to peace for all and also peace for women. And you mentioned my participation in the negotiations with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, one of the several armed groups that have been fighting the government. We did sign the agreement in 2014. It might not be very familiar. It might be a case that's not very familiar to most people, but it's an autonomous arrangement that has it was a negotiation that largely tried to come to terms with a segment of the minority population, the Muslim population concentrated in the southern part of the Philippines that has been fighting for acknowledgement of their unique identity and also for their right to self-governance. And the resulting arrangement is precisely to provide them with that kind of internal self-determination in the form of a regional autonomous government. So it was a journey indeed. It was a very difficult journey. The whole negotiation itself took 17 years. I came in the last lap, not as the chair, but eventually becoming the chair of the negotiations in 2012, and eventually finishing most of the substantive part of the agreement. But we do need to credit all the men and women who were very there from the beginning in 1997, when the first effort to put something in place and finally end the armed conflict. But participating in such an official process, you might have been brought into that position perhaps because you are a member of the bureaucracy, and we don't know that for most parts the institutions that are tapped for these kinds of work will necessarily be the male-dominated institutions. In our case, that would of course be the military. So in the beginning, there were many generals involved, and most of the church from civil society will also be sort of considered having that moral authority. I mean, the churches in this case, including the ulama, which is of course a smaller segment of the religious community, but certainly what we find is that that most of the institutions that are normally tapped to provide this kind of work on matters relating to war would necessarily come also from male-dominated institutions. In our case, in my case, I came actually from civil society, being a peace advocate, a peace activist, realizing as early as the late 1980s that the democratic space that has opened up after the dictatorship provided a lot of opportunities to be able to settle this through peaceful means and not necessarily have to go and overextend this conflict that has confounded our nation for decades. And it was not just the Moro separatist groups at the time, but it was also the communist insurgency, which today has yet to be resolved. So that meant that my own journey actually started out from below, from the bottom, as a peace advocate, perhaps in Metro Manila, but actually linking up with other segments of the population, and eventually trying to bring shape to an agenda, a national agenda that would encompass all the different dimensions of this conflict. We know that conflicts have deep roots, they have historical roots, and they encompass all of these matters from social, economic, political, and so on. So actually, just before I was appointed as a member and eventually chair of the government negotiating panel, which meant that I crossed over from being a civil society advocate to one coming in and representing a government, we were actually putting in shape what eventually came out as the first national action plan on, on women, peace, and security, that we were able to, lobby government to officialize by way of adopting it with some modifications, and later on putting in some of the details, but eventually adopting it as the country's national action plan. And that process involved bringing together different women from geographic areas, but also from different sectors, as well as different movements, from the women's movement, the peace movement, the human rights movement, bringing them together in order to shape this women, peace, and security agenda that the government adopted. And in the negotiation process, of course, we did try to bring in as much as we can into the agreement, and eventually, not only in terms of participation of women in the process, but also in terms of the kind of provisions that would be included in what eventually became the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. So I think basically what I'm trying to say is that getting involved in official processes does not happen in an instant. It is a product of all of these networks and linkages and advocacies that are being done, that are that sort of accumulate until you create precisely you find the right moment, and you have that kind of momentum to be able to put women in peace leadership, and women accompanying at different levels, accompanying other women who are put in that position, and also accompanying the whole process to ensure that you get maximum results based on the context, the opportunities of the moment. And if you cannot get this maximum results that you do want to achieve, so you sort of always have to do all of these compromises, carry it through to the next stage, and see how far more you can push your agenda. That's it, Maryann, for my sharing on this round.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for your tenacious work and for the long-term time frame that you have. As you said, peace is not built in a day, neither is women's inclusion in these processes. So thank you for going the distance and staying for that long-term accompaniment of the process. And we'll continue back to you in our next round as we go for lessons learned. But now, still on the descriptive round, we'll hear next from Dr. Laurie Johnston. She serves on the steering committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. She is an associate professor of theology at Emmanuel College in Boston, and she is a women's leader in peacebuilding as the executive vice president of the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue. Dr. Johnston, Sant'Egidio has been in the news for its negotiations work in South Sudan. We understand Pope Francis is going to South Sudan next month to continue this momentum of work that you have been that Sant'Egidio has been active in. Can you tell us a little bit about women's leadership in peace building and expanding women's participation in peace building, including Sant'Egidio's work in South Sudan?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Maryann. And I just want to start by echoing your words about how often it's true that women's work in peacebuilding is always present and not often visible or acknowledged. And that's certainly a theme that has come up for us many times. And I should note actually that came up in our research at CPN for the book that we recently published on Catholic peacebuilding and mining. And in my concluding chapter for that, I wrote about how often it's women leading the way in calling attention to the consequences of disruptive mining projects and the violence that often accompanies them. But in terms of my work with the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, elevating women's voices is a key priority, and especially because many local Sant'Egidio communities are women-led. But as you mentioned, this is also a focus in the South Sudan peace process right now, which you might recall was sparked by Pope Francis's dramatic gesture of kissing the feet of several key South Sudanese leaders when they were in Rome. And what was widely reported was that he kissed the feet of the male leaders, but he also kissed the feet of the female leaders who were there, including Rebecca Garang, the widow of the late John Garang. So women have been part of what has come to be called the Rome Initiative for South Sudan since day one. It's mostly a question of making that visible, celebrating it, acknowledging it. But I also want to note that it's not enough to make sure that women are represented at the negotiating table. As Miriam was explaining, it's also important for women to be represented in civil society, and then that often leads to more significant political roles. But empowering women behind the scenes is just as crucial. And one way in which we're working on this right now is by supporting the development of new narratives, new ways of storytelling by women about the conflict in South Sudan and about the possibility of peace. And this is not new. Women are often involved in shaping cultural narratives in key ways, sometimes in dramatic ways. We heard one activist from South Sudan tell a story about how during a previous round of negotiations during the war between Sudan and South Sudan, a women's group snuck into the negotiating room during the lunch hour and left photographs of starving Sudanese children on the desks of the negotiating team as a way of reminding them what is the real story that we need to be focused on here. There are also a lot of ways in which this narrative, this storytelling, helps create networks. So telling the story of Lema Gboe and the dramatic involvement of women in Liberia in working for peace there, that in turn has inspired a group of South Sudanese women who've been planning a peace march to coincide with the Pope's visit. Sadly, the Pope's visit has actually been postponed. We hope that it will still happen, but for now it's off. But we certainly hope this peace march will happen anyway. And I also want to note that this kind of networking and collaborating to think about how the stories of conflict are told is something that as Sant'Egidio we've also encountered at the highest level, not just the grassroots. So Sant'Egidio is a founding member of a network called GAMAC, the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes. And this is a platform that works on trying to find collaborative ways to prevent genocide rather than just confrontational ways. And this collaborative focus, I think, is not coincidental because this network was created by a group of primarily women senior diplomats, including the Swiss diplomat Mo Blecker, who I'm sure Miriam and others on our panel are familiar with. So it's not a coincidence, I think, that the focus there is collaborative. It's also an effort to incorporate voices from civil society into genocide prevention to ensure that governments, state actors have access to expertise from civil society in a structured and systematic and formal way on a regular basis. And that creating systematic ways for civil society to inform government processes is also a really important way to elevate women's voices, because even in situations where they may not be well represented in official governments, you will always find women in leadership roles of various kinds in civil society. And so finding those channels is really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you for giving us that information about the ways in which women's voices are being raised in civil society and in South Sudan. Some really interesting examples that you provide, and thank you for this excellent work. Obviously, another theme of the long-term work in building peace, and that conflict has been ongoing for a long time, as well as the peace processes have been ongoing. We turn next to continue this part of our discussion looking at building capacity and working with civil society. We turn now to Milo Aguero, a leader in peace building in Mindanao in the Philippines for over 2 decades. She serves as the Justice, Peace Building, and Social Cohesion Coordinator for Catholic Relief Services in the Asia region. She also led in the Advancing Interreligious Peace Building program. She is a core leader and president of the Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute, the Board of Trustees, an organization that she helped to organize and found in partnership with her work at Catholic Relief Services. Myla also serves on the steering committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and she was one of many women who were nominated for the 2005 Nobel Peace Prize. Ms. Leguro, most people have not been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So congratulations, it is well deserved. As one of the founders of the famed Mindanao Peace Institute and a leader in Catholic Relief Services Peace Building Program, thank you for joining us this morning, and please describe for us some of your work in this area.
Thank you, Maryann, and greetings of peace to the members of the panel. It's truly indeed an honor to be speaking alongside the inspiring women who actually provide many creative ways of engaging in peace building, despite of the many challenges that we encounter as women peace builders. I greet you from the Philippines, and really from the work that we do is actually leveraging on the work of Professor Miriam Coronel-Ferrer on her work on the formal peace process. CRS, alongside with many local NGOs, peace-building organizations, have been engaged in peace-building work, supporting informally peace process efforts, but also accompanying the formal peace process efforts since the late 1990s. So really been engaging in how we're able to bring meaningful participation and visibility of civil society groups in the peace process. So probably perhaps in terms of my sharing, I'll focus on the current efforts that we're doing, and it's really building on the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security for the Philippines, but by particularly honing on what we're doing in terms of localizing the efforts in the Bangsamoro region. And again, we're benefiting from the signed peace agreement of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, which is of course the work of Professor Ferrer. And it's currently now really ensuring that women are part of implementing the peace process, the peace agreement, at the same time ensuring that women continue to provide that support and contribution. So currently, where there's a robust local engagement in peace building work, still as well noted in the introduction, women do have still very limited representation and participation in formal processes. So there is still low participation in relation to Bangsamoro women engagement in governance within the areas where political transition is happening. So there are actually less than 20% of provincial municipal leaders that are women in the Bangsamoro region. And in the Bangsamoro Parliament, there are actually the 80 members of Bangsamoro Parliament. There are only 13 women, and a few number of women ministers in the current Bangsamoro government. So in that aspect, our current work is really focused on one of the pillars of the regional action plan of the Bangsamoro Women Commission, focusing on women, peace, and security. And that is actually how we're able to increase and advance participation of women in political and decision-making processes. So a key part of the work that we do is really capacitating and really working alongside women leaders so that they're able to increase their capacities in political engagement. And a key part of that support is actually working with women organizations. And by way of working with women organizations, then we are able to also slowly push the space where they're able to, in a sense, engage formally in local governance processes. And so a key part of the work that is being done by the women are developing their own peace and development agenda, which builds on analyzing issues around women, peace, and security in their communities, and developing a peace and development agenda that would actually push for policies, push for priority programs that will be responsive to the needs of not just women, but the communities that are affected post-conflict in many of the areas. And so a key part of that, I guess, and recognition that while we do support capacity building and also engagement and increased visibility and participation of women in governance mechanisms within the context of the political transition, there is a recognition that we need to engage and improve the enabling environment for women participation. So a key part of that is really developing dialogue spaces and convenings with male political leaders, because male leaders still dominate the political landscape, and also the importance of engaging the traditional religious leaders to look at and harness, for example, religious and spiritual teachings that actually highlight the role of women in the public space. So that continuing work, of course, is done through many local organizations. And a key part of that, of course, is to be able to hopefully move towards meaningful participation of women in conflict response and conflict mitigation processes in the communities, because again, they are invisible in these formal structures, even in the formal peace process mechanism. So it's a continuing work, Maryann, from then until now, in terms of how we're actually ensuring that there's space, meaningful space for women engagement in peace building processes and efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Myla, for your work and for describing it for us. And we're seeing a theme here of a long-term road to peace and long-term engagement in these issues, something we've also heard from our next panelist. We now thank Tetiana Stawnychy, President of Caritas Ukraine, for taking time from your important work in the war in Ukraine to speak with us today. President Stawnychy, congratulations and condolences. Congratulations on being made president of Caritas Ukraine, a very important leadership position and an important organization, in August 2021 on the Feast of Our Lady of Angels. And condolences. Just months after taking on this leadership role, Ukraine was invaded by neighbor Russia, or more accurately, the 2014 invasion of Ukraine was expanded and brutally intensified. We extend our condolences to you. The Caritas Ukraine office in the besieged city of Mariupol was attacked by a Russian tank, which killed 7 people, including 2 of your female Caritas Ukraine colleagues. We hold them and you in prayer. As you know, the United Nations Security Council recently noted that rape is being used as a weapon of war in Ukraine. You and Caritas Ukraine are ministering to women and children fleeing the violence. How are you doing this, and how can you explain some of your work to us now in providing emergency services while also protecting vulnerable people?
Thank you, Maryann, for the introduction. Thank you for including me in this panel discussion. Very distinguished other speakers. To start off my comments, I'd like to start with just bring your attention to the magnitude of the crisis that we're experiencing. Because of the war and the fighting, 30% of the population has been displaced over a period of 3 months. It's a huge displacement, and it creates huge challenges both abroad in the neighboring countries and also in Ukraine. What I wanted to point out when we talk about peace building is sometimes we talk about women leaders, and today I want to talk about the roles that women play, maybe not in top leadership in peace building, but the role that they play in their daily life in peace building. So as many of you know, women and children are primarily the 2 highest groups that are being displaced in Ukraine. And for me and for Caritas in general, we have both staff working in 36 centers throughout the country, and we've been ministering to this movement of people coming through the country, some of them leaving, some of them staying. But what I want to point out is the heroism and the peace building of the women who are taking their children and the elderly to safety. So they're taking upon themselves to travel, to go, to care for. And despite all the trauma and the pain that's around that, we're already seeing that place where women are showing resilience. Yeah? And this moment of resilience, I think, is that peace, resilience, and then coming out of that place of hurt together, and then finding that path to peace building. Many of you mentioned the importance of networks and women's role in shaping the narrative. Certainly women are shaping the narrative in the current crisis in Ukraine. It's kind of hard to talk just about women serving, because in the crisis, with the magnitude that it is, it's simply all hands on deck. And there actually isn't such a distinction in roles. Yeah, so when there's a need to receive people in our centers, to offer them those first basic needs of food, hygiene, shelter, it's women and men working. When it's sending packages into Eastern Ukraine and having to load them onto the trains that are heading in that direction, it's women and men both serving and doing the work. So the all hands on deck, and yet there is a special role, I think, for women. In the work that we'd been doing before, we worked a lot on the question of localization, and that was working with local governments, and really women took a leading role in this direction. We also had a very robust peace building project that we had enacted for 5 years, also led by a woman, very dynamic. And what was interesting for me, and this was in terms of peace building, it was more about social cohesion, about working through collective traumas, and finding dialogue in difficult situations between different categories. So when you have IDPs or you have host communities, and finding ways to interact between those two communities. What was interesting for me, we had a session with our directors of our local centers a couple of weeks ago, and we were asking them, okay, what do you see as the main needs right now in terms of the crisis, and what do you see going forward? And at least half of them mentioned this peace building process that we had started 5 years ago. They said, bring it back. We need it again. We need to start working on those topics. So again, in Ukraine, we're a little bit, you could say the crisis started in 2014, but in terms of the magnitude and the countrywide effort that's underway right now, you could say we're pretty early on into the process. And we still have a long ways to go. So I thank you for the opportunity to present a little bit about our work here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tetiana, for your courageous work, and all of your colleagues in Caritas Ukraine for what will be a long haul effort to, we hope, build a more peaceful world in that situation. We now turn for our next round of questioning. We'll have a little shorter period of time for our panelists to respond, and we'll ask our panelists to tell us a bit about the lessons learned and your prescriptions, what you would prescribe be done to expand women's leadership in peace building. So we'll turn first to Miriam, if you'd be willing to start us off here in telling us your lessons learned or your prescriptions for women's inclusion in peace building.
Much of what has been said really resonate to all the different contexts that that we find ourselves in terms of the kinds of engagements that women do, the kinds of perspective that they bring over to the problem-solving arenas that are brought to them, especially in conflict areas. But what we see, of course, is that a lot of challenges still remain. So maybe in that sense, while we want this kind of, it's very good to see these multiple efforts coming from everywhere, supported by different sources, and emerging in different forms of campaigns, events, programs, organizations. To a certain extent, there's still a problem of really being able to institutionalize this. And of course, we are very wary of institutions getting really stuck in paradigms that are very, very difficult to undo. But that's precisely the big challenge for the work on women, peace, and security. How do we make sure that the institutions themselves actually build this into their own frameworks and into their own programming? Some of the work that I've done, for instance, with the UN Standby team of mediators, was to see how UN missions are being able to integrate into the whole program of the missions. I've worked only with 2 actually, but these were, in that sense, these were very informative, precisely along the track of seeing how we actually mainstream this agenda. So there's a problem, there's the question of being able to acknowledge all these different initiatives to see what women are actually doing on the ground. But at the end of the day, what we really need is precisely these kinds of institutional restructuring that, that takes away the glass ceiling, that makes it easier actually that for women to be able to participate in all of these processes. So it's very clear that women bring perspectives that might not be brought to the attention of people who are making the decisions if they were not there. That if they were not there, these perspectives would actually be dropped along the way or considered insignificant or not important. And therefore, their participation in all of these decision-making processes are really very crucial to complete the picture, to ensure that all angles are adequately addressed. And we do say that the kind of perspectives women bring has a large may be largely because of their socialization, but the end of as mothers, as wives, as victims, but at the end of the day, that's precisely where we don't want them to get stuck in. I think very close to Tetiana's experience when she said that during wartime, women actually take on roles that are mainly performed by men because the men are gone, they're fighting, or they're somewhere else, or they actually died, or they're stuck in evacuation centers and they take up roles. But when things sort of normalize, they go back to their normal roles as basically staying in the household and not having any public role anymore. Whereas in difficult situations, they actually went beyond the private household to become community leaders. So I think to that extent, it's also going precisely beyond what women stereotypically do and getting into the public space, not only because of their roles, social roles as women, but precisely because they also have something to say about the whole, not just about women, but precisely all about this, what people would consider probably the hard issues of peace and security, and not be relegated to the soft issue of impact on women and so on, and very, very focused just on gender. But these two are, of course, very, very much related because there are gender dimensions to all the big issues of peace and security. I know I'm talking at a very, very high level, trying to bring these macro experiences into something which is really the whole agenda of being able to change the world, being able to change institutions, structures, and therefore relationships, and really being able to do that where the decision-making are being done. And that's where, in fact, a lot of women, there's not enough women being part of the decision-making. Let me stop there.
Very excellent. Thank you for those excellent comments, and particularly noting that when women step up into leadership roles during the crises, that we need to keep that space open for them when things settle down within a country. We turn now to Dr. Johnston. We're keeping an eye on the clock. Maybe we'll shorten our time responses a little bit, but looking forward to hearing your comments, Laurie, on prescriptions and lessons learned.
Sure. I think if we start from the assumption that women are always everywhere building peace anyway, the prescription is to get out of their way and to try to remove obstacles. Violence is the obstacle. Violence is an interruption. So delegitimizing the people making war because they're undermining the work that women are doing is an important part of the task here. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that there are obstacles that we need to remove within the church for Catholic women too. Miriam noted how it's often difficult for women to stay in public roles. And that's partly because it's not unusual for church leaders and even church documents to talk about women's roles in society in very specific and circumscribed ways. You know, even like, for instance, in Caritas Amazonia, the document of the Amazon Synod, it says that it's important for women to have a role in important decisions and the direction of communities in a way that reflects their womanhood, which is immediately a way of circumscribing their role without necessarily intending to. So obstacles to women in public life remain. The other piece I would just say is that we know that including women is important, and Miriam very clearly explained why. But it's also true that we can't just sort of add women and stir. It's including women has to be done in a way that's not sort of based on a grudging recognition that maybe it's wrong to include women, maybe it's wrong to exclude women. I think you can find many people who will say, oh, I guess it's wrong. It needs to be done on the basis of believing that, no, there's something genuinely added, something without which we cannot create a sustainable peace, something that we need. In the words of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, we need to not be content with remaining enclosed in one fragment of reality. We need all of the pieces of reality, and that means everybody's voices.
Thank you, Laurie. That's a wonderful way of putting it. We can't just add women and stir. It's a great reflection. Myla, can you tell us your own experiences and your lessons learned and prescriptions you would offer for expanding women's leadership and participation in peace building?
Thank you, Maryann. I guess for us, it's really recognizing that in terms of women engagement in peace leadership and in many different aspects of the society, really recognizing that there are institutional, cultural, economic barriers to why women are not able to engage, despite of the fact that they have the talents, the experience, and also the perspectives that can actually contribute to the work in terms of making it comprehensive. As we would know, how should peace building should be comprehensive. And in the process that we do, our approach is really multi-pronged, really recognizing that in terms of the work with women, it has to have dimensions of transformation of the person or the individual, acknowledging that within themselves there are personal limitations and also constraints, because a lot of times they have been socialized by society not to participate. They are discouraged from participating because of, again, the gender roles that they are ascribed to in the society. The importance of transformation in the relationships, so making sure that while we do change with the women, there's also a process of engaging other gender identities, especially the male leaders or male members of the society, to actually provide that space and enabling environment for women to actually engage. And more importantly, we recognize that change should actually happen in structures and systems. And so a key part of the work that we do is really making sure that, well, we do capacity building, empowerment, and leadership building with women. We build relationships through the women organizations because they really gain a lot of confidence, and also the political capital with the women organizations. They are also given formal recognitions if they are within the women organizations themselves. It's really important that working on the structures and system, it has to connect with the personal relational change. So a key part of the work that we do is actually, as what Professor Ferrer is saying, the importance of institutionalization. So really ensuring that there is work on policy engagement of the institutions from the local level, in our case, from the village, the municipal, provincial, to regional, and even at the national level, so that we're able to really bring in within policy, structures, and systems, the kind of change that the women would do based on their analysis of their needs as developed within their peace and development mission.
Thank you, Milo. So important to always remember that changing those structures is absolutely key. We turn now to Tetiana for your thoughts on prescriptions and lessons learned for advancing the participation and leadership of women in peace building.
So thank you. As I was listening to all the different speakers offer their reflections, there was one thought that just kept coming back to me. And it's something that we've been focusing a lot now in Ukraine, is this understanding that we exist in a fabric of society. Yeah? And that fabric of society is created by relationships, by the way that we interact with one another. One of the things I think that we're seeing in Ukraine in terms of peace building, is we're seeing that fabric has held in a very powerful way. I think a big part of that has been this role of women. The women are the ones who are fleeing with the children. The women are the ones For example, in our Caritas centers, there's maybe not exactly even, it's about maybe 60% to 40% women and men. Yeah, so actually women take a lead role in our Caritas organizations. But you see them playing this role of holding things together, of building relationships, of building dialogue. And I think that when we think about these higher level peace building initiatives, when we think about working our way up the government structures, I think that that's that piece, that fabric that holds together, is that piece that's going to rise up, yeah, and then it'll play a role in these kind of higher peace building initiatives. Yeah, so it's the individuals, but it's the individuals with relationships. So all the things that the speakers had talked about, this importance of network, of localization, of having these local contacts, of shaping the narrative, of and bringing to the table their understanding. Yeah, that these are all the pieces, but they all, for me, they still fall into that understanding of a fabric. Yeah, that we're part of a whole, and we function when we function well together. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's pretty indicative of the value added that women bring to the peace processes. Is that more holistic understanding of things as a common fabric. We have a question now from our audience from Maria Lucia Zapata, I believe from Colombia. And she is asking for Myla, if you could say a little bit more about building capacity, particularly among youth and female youth.
So we actually work with a roster of about 400 women leaders. They come from 94 women organizations around the Bangsamoro region. And a percentage of the women leaders that we work with are young women leaders. So they are actually grassroots leaders working at the community level and now would want to really engage in terms of political leadership. So the capacity building workshops that we do actually work on empowerment and leadership, sharing with the women what are actually legal laws, policies that support women engagement, so that when they do engage local political leaders, they have a basis actually for engagement, looking at laws and policies. A key part of that also is engaging the women in how they are able to actually develop policy proposals based on formulated and developed peace and development agenda. And again, this comes from a whole process of analyzing their context, looking at relationships, and what are actually priority programs and interventions that would actually address not just the needs of women, but actually the needs of the whole community. So it's actually a number of programs that we do, capacity building programs, not us teaching them, but it's really working with women teaching each other in terms of how they're able to engage.
Thank you, and that's so important to be developing that capacity in the next generation of leadership. I wonder if we could ask all our panelists to make sure we all turn our cameras on now for a final kind of speed round in which I ask, what gives you hope? The title of our conference is Hope in a Wounded World. And maybe we'll start with Myla and go in reverse order here. See your camera up first. What gives you hope, Myla?
It's actually the work of the grassroots peace builders. So they are the ones who are actually at the front lines, and to really see the many creative efforts that they do to actually overcome violence, overcome division. And despite of the fact that there are cycles of violence in their communities, they continue the work. But it's really how they are building solidarity and really investing in that hope that someday Mindanao will actually experience enduring peace, sustainable peace. So that gives me.
Sorry, Tetiana, can you tell us what gives you hope?
Sure, that was an easy one. When we think about war and we think about the destruction that it brings, the thing that brings me hope is this practical expressions of love, this solidarity, this relationships. Yeah, it's that fabric again, the relationships where there are people helping one another. And we have these examples of IDPs who come, they receive help in our centers, and then they turn around and they start to help other IDPs. They join us either as volunteers or as staff members. And it's that that dedication to seeing a human being in the other person, and that willingness to help and to be in solidarity with them is what gives me hope.
And you see that in participation and the agency of these women, even during crises. Laurie, can you tell us what gives you hope?
Sure. It's certainly true that war brings out the worst of humanity, but as Tetiana was saying, it also brings out the best of humanity often. But what gives me the most hope is just seeing, especially young women, continuing to dream of peace. And if they don't give up that dream, then surely I can't give up that dream either.
Well said. And how about you, Miriam? What gives you hope?
I think all of us have different sources of hope. It can be religious, spiritual, it can be some other things. But yes, we give each other hope. And we have a hashtag that goes hashtag WIW, and it stands for Women Inspiring Women for Peace. And I think it's very powerful, that kind of sisterhood that can actually sustain this hope, and that's very, very important to keep it there, because women need inspiration, and they get that a lot from the other women who's saying, look, this can be done, and that has to be sustained. That kind of sisterhood has to be sustained.
Well put. I will just draw us to conclusion by answering this question: what gives us hope in a wounded world? All of you. These women leaders are beacons of hope in a wounded world, against all odds, against tremendous obstacles, against systematic structures of entrenched bias and exclusion. These women persist, are resilient, are creative, and very effective leaders in peace building. I'd ask all of this in this meeting as we end our Zoom session to hold these women in our prayers. God, creator of peace, help us all to be peace builders, to be hope in a world of crisis. Thank you for sustaining these women and strengthening them, and strengthening all of us who work in building peace, strengthening all of us in our work. Thank you for this conference time of being in community and solidarity with others, of being part of a common fabric and working to build peace. And as we each bring our small loaves and fish to a world hungry for peace, we thank you, knowing that you will multiply and amplify our efforts to build a more just peace. Amen. And thank you all for taking the time from your very demanding work and efforts. And I wish you nothing but blessings and strength going forward, to our panelists and all who will be joining us either on recorded or live in this conference. Wish you nothing but blessings and strength going forward in our work to build peace in a wounded world. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.